Hello and welcome to Mythic Mind Games, where we discuss video games through the lens of the Christian humanities. I'm Dr. Andrew Snyder, and I'm glad that you're here. Hey there, welcome back. Unfortunately, we don't have our episode on Mass Effect 3 ready to go. The reality is that right now I am just slammed busy. I'm still working on my book that I really need to wrap up as soon as possible. I'm teaching multiple classes. I've got a few new classes coming up this fall semester in just a few weeks. And so I'm just, in addition to having 3 kids, 3 and under, and so my life is just slammed busy. I did not have a chance to record that conversation yet. Hopefully we will get there for next time. So today what I'm going to do is provide you with episode 80 from the main Mythic Mind podcast as I speak with Josh Traylor and Master Samwise, who runs a pretty big YouTube channel, dealing with some of the things that are related to what we do here. In fact, he was on the show for Red Dead 2 not too long ago. And so we'll provide that conversation for you. This is from March of 2025. This is when I was just starting to really formulate these ideas about the potential value of video games as an art form, and that they may have some kind of upbuilding utility to them, some kind of real artistic value that can move us in a positive direction. And so I'm just starting to work on these ideas as I record this conversation. I think that we go to some worthwhile places, and I hope that you enjoy. And next time we'll try to get some fresh content for you. All right, let's go ahead and get to it. All right, welcome back to Mythic Mind, where today we're going to do something we haven't done so far on the show, and that's going to talk about video games. I'm sure we'll get into some specific titles, but really just I want us to have a broad level conversation of like, what even are video games? Is it just a waste of time, or is there some value to be had there? And given that we're having this conversation, I guess it's kind of obvious where we're going to come down on that. But it might be helpful to start off just by talking a little bit about like some of our background, our experience with games as a medium. I know as a kid, as a teenager, I played a good bit, probably more than I should have. Kind of wish I read a few more books, but nonetheless, in many ways, kind of not having much of a literary focus as a kid, aside from what I picked up in school here and there. I do kind of feel like looking back, games did kind of fulfill some of that innate human desire for stories, for entering into other worlds, that sort of enchantment. And so I think there's something there that I can see looking back. Once I went out on my own, once I got married, a lot of that sort of dropped off quite a bit. Once I had kids, dropped off a lot more to the point where now, I mean, every once in a while I'll pick up something, but it's usually the same something I've been playing for 10 or more years, because even though I picked up a couple things during a Steam sale not too long ago, the reality is if I have a few minutes to pick up a game these days, I tend to just go for familiarity. But I do think that there's something to this question of like, what are games? What are their value? Does it make sense to bring them to conversation as a medium with something like literature? It's what's inspired the fact that later on this year I'm doing that Elder Scrolls and philosophy course. I'm inclined to have this conversation, and I'm interested to hear what you all have to say. Sam, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, about specifically your relationship with games?
Sure. So yeah, I'm in my early 30s, but I have a relatively short relationship with video games as a medium. Not that I haven't played video games for a long. I have played video games since I was probably 6, 7 years old, maybe a little bit older. But it started out, and for probably the vast majority of my childhood, from about 7 or 8 up till 16, I probably played backyard baseball or backyard soccer. I'm familiar with those old titles that most likely came in the bottom of a cereal box. Or I played something like Roller Coaster Tycoon, where you're just building and maintaining a theme park. Lego Star Wars also came in a little bit later. Once the family computer was up to the task. So I didn't really start playing games more extensively till I was later in high school. And then I was into things like Call of Duty and Star Wars Battlefront and a lot of first person shooters, ones that may be are not completely devoid of value, but certainly just have kind of a more entertainment, casual nature. Again, you can find value in most anything that isn't just complete trash. But and those games were anyway generally made with love and care, and they the stories they told were somewhat solid. But admittedly, most of the time was just spent in multiplayer, shooting other people who were also shooting back at me. Um, so it wasn't honestly till probably after college, so the last, gosh, how long have we graduated? Less than a decade, that I really started diving into more of the deeper world of video games, right? So I've played, Elden Ring after that came out, which is this huge, vast, dark fantasy world, and the makers of all the Dark Souls games. And the last few years, I've played the God of War, all the God of War games, and I think the second one, which are generally absolutely phenomenal games, and they tell a fantastic story. I finally played Red Dead Redemption 2 this last year, which is hard to beat when it comes to just the depth of the story and the character development. And I think what games have an advantage over something like, even literature, but certainly over television and movies is the depth to which they can go because just because they are able to take all this time. Because television, even television, movies especially, but even TV shows are limited, right? And there is kind of a set limit on how long they can be, even in the age of streaming, where you can really only be so long. You can only do so much. Games don't really have that problem. If you look on my channel, my longest videos are all about video game characters because you spend so much more time with them. If you spend 20 hours or 50 or 60 hours playing through a game, you spend so much time with this character. You're able to absorb these little details and you get a lot more out of it. So, yeah, I think basically that's kind of my journey with games is it's just in the last, less than 10 years or so where I really come to absorb the value that they can have in their ability to tell stories. But then there's more to it than that. And there's a video I'm planning to do in probably in the distant future at this point on how video games cultivate virtue. And storytelling is certainly one way. And the ways in which they can tell stories that are distinct from books and movies are good and definitely need to be measured. But there are other ways in that they can teach perseverance. They can teach, explore the desire to explore and wonder, um, that can even teach logistical thinking and planning and thinking ahead. And if you take up games like factory games, where you're planning and building, a factory, you're collecting resource. There are all sorts of ways in which games can uh, build us. They're fascinating, basically.
Good. Yeah, you said a lot there. I've got a lot of follow-up questions, but first let's jump over to Josh. Tell us a little bit about your experience with video games.
Oh man, yeah. I think I'm a little bit more in your camp, Andrew, where you said that you feel like you played a lot of video games and maybe even a little bit too much at times and wish you would have read more. That's like an exact summary of like the first like 20 something odd years of my life. Um, so yeah, for me, I actually like pretty much have played since basically as long as I can remember and before because my dad was like in his 20s when like the OG like Nintendo and all that came out in the 80s. And so when I was born in the mid 90s, like he already had like Sega Genesis and was it Super Nintendo, eventually Nintendo 64, PS1, Dreamcast. So I really like cut my teeth on all of that stuff, like that 90s gaming, even though I was extremely little in the second half of the 90s when I was a toddler. But really from there kind of like got more I definitely like stuck with like the Nintendo a lot and wasn't really allowed to play like a lot of like the M-rated games at the time. So probably good decisions on my parents probably for that one. So played like a lot of GameCube, played like a lot of N64. Eventually probably got like more into like the Microsoft, like Xbox 360 stuff when I was in like middle school and high school. Eventually kind of like got into I was super into Halo at one point. Like those games were great and I thought that they had exceptional writing as well. And I mean I played a lot of different stuff probably all the way up until my early 20s and then just it's not like I never like lost interest or like saw there as like I never really went through a phase where even where I thought like video games were like stupid or pointless or a waste of time, I would say. And I would certainly still argue against all of those claims to this day. I think I started to find interest in other things more probably that I didn't spend time on growing up, like music and eventually like reading as well. So probably like distanced myself a little bit more. So my knowledge of gaming really spans from stuff from like the late '90s probably to roughly like the mid 20 teens. So I'm a good like decade out of the loop, I would say, with a lot of things. The only One of the only really RPG games I've played in the past 10 years is Cyberpunk 2077, which I definitely have things to say if it comes up. But pretty much like a long story short, that's like kind of like the broad sweeping overview of really my experiences.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, we have some similar stories there. I feel like the newest game that I still play on a somewhat regular basis is probably like Fallout 4 or something. Like it goes back a little bit at this point. Um, you know, one thing that I've been thinking about because I've over the last few years, I've really been going through a renaissance as I've really discovered literature for the first time. It took me to like almost finishing my PhD before I recognized the value of reading fiction. And at that point, I just started reading everything I could get my hands on, and it really reshaped the way that I view just about everything, really. Especially, it really started with Tolkien, and then getting into like, his on fairy stories and sort of his philosophy of myths and that sort of thing. And that's allowed me to look back on some of the games that really stood out to me, especially in my youth, and recognize that like maybe they're not just a waste of time. I definitely went through that phase where I felt like, it's just escape, but as Tolkien says, escape is part of the process of recovery. And so I do believe that there's some value there, but at the same time, I'm working through this in real time. I wonder how much the games are just fun, where there's the amusement factor, and then I want to justify value into it, into the story. I don't know. Is that do you think that's a temptation when we talk about like, Sam, you're talking about like how we can discover virtue in video games and, different positive lessons. Like, uh,
Mhm.
do you have any comment on that? Like, how much is that real and how much are we trying to justify something?
Well, I would say that if you are finding value in something, then the value exists, right? I mean, I've done this with any number of things. You can read value into most anything, right? I would say it's, how does it actually change you, right? If I'm playing, Dark Souls and I'm like, oh, this is teaching me persistence, but then I don't actually persist in my life when it matters. Well, it's not really teaching me persistence. It's not really changing me. It's not really enriching that virtue in me. It's just me. That is just me justifying it. Absolutely. Um, but I have seen multiple testimonies on that game specifically about people saying like this saved my life, right? Where people, if you go on YouTube and search, Dark Souls, you search Dark Souls saved my life, you will find, I'm sure, no shortage of videos of people saying that they were in a dark place, they felt hopeless and helpless, right? They had felt like they had um no power, right? They couldn't do anything. And then they picked up Dark Souls. And the game, if you haven't played it, and it beats you over the head, quite literally. It beats you down repeatedly, over and over and over again. The game is designed, unless you really go out of your way to make it easy for yourself, which you can do, but it is designed to kill you repeatedly. The One of the versions that came out on PC anyway, I'm not sure if it's the original version, is called Dark Souls Prepare to Die. And the game tells you right away, like you're going to die and you're going to die a lot. And all you can do is get better. I mean, that's it. You can, yeah, sure, you can do various things to do that, right? But the main thing is simply getting better at the game, learning the boss's attack patterns, learning when to attack, when not to attack, learning when it's time to change your own weapon or your build, your strategy, and it teaches people to have an internal attribution where they say, okay, this failure is clearly just my fault, right? And the only thing I can do about it is change because the game's not going to change, right? When we think about this in the wider world, I think people want society to change. They want other people to change for them, right? This is a huge problem in culture today where everyone has an external attribution, right? The things that have happened to me aren't my fault. You might be right about that, but what are you going to do about it? Right. So we need to have more of like an internal attribution. That's what Dark Souls teaches. Through repeatedly crushing your skull in, it teaches you to look inward and say, okay, where am I failing? What do I need to do to get out of this, to get past this boss? It's again, it's a very small thing where you could just, it can be contained within the world of the game, right? If you learn that lesson in Dark Souls and you don't apply it to your life, I mean, yeah, that's what most people might very well do. But for these people, right, who actually let it change them, I mean, then it changed them. It did something meaningful. Um, so yeah, again, it is with most mediums, video games are simply about how you approach them, right? Intentionality is huge. I could read the most profoundly philosophical book on the planet, but if I do it just because I want to say that I've read the most profoundly philosophical book on the planet, who cares? What good is that? What has that changed me? You know, so I think that's the big piece when it comes to video games. And I know you've pointed this out, Andrew, in a, a tweet of yours. It said, "Thank you. How we approach them, our intentionality, that's what matters." So if you find good in something, sorry, I'm rambling on too long. I'll stop myself here. If you find good in something, you actually let that good affect you, then it's real.
Yeah, I think that's very well said. I mean, it is just like anything that, if you are pursuing it for the sake of discovering wisdom, then you're likely to find it.
Hmm.
Whereas if you are pursuing it just for the sake of, justifying the wrong kind of escape, then obviously at that point it's a vice. But then it's not necessarily the fault of the medium; it's the fault of the player, the one participating in it.
Hmm.
Yeah, so I think that's very very well said. Um, Josh, do you have any thoughts on that? On discovering wisdom, on how video games can potentially serve a positive role? What kind of wherever you want to go with that?
Yeah, and absolutely. I mean, I certainly agree with everything he just said, and I appreciate the nods and mentions to Dark Souls because that was certainly, one of the series that's certainly like one of the only series that I've really played a lot in like my adult life. And that's like one of my I always go back to this kind of game. Certainly not always for relaxation because it's hard to relax and play Dark Souls, even if you're experienced. Sometimes it's still challenging and frustrating, even when you fail. But another thing I want to like say with Dark Souls specifically is um what actually drew me into that game. It was yes, it was the challenge, it was the difficulty, but the best word I could use kind of to describe the world and the lore and the aesthetics of Dark Souls is enchanting, to be honest. And it's the same thing that I think any one of us could find enchanting about the best of like the fantasy genre, right? Whether you're talking about the great works of the Middle Ages, or you're talking about Tolkien, or maybe even some of the contemporary later modern works that came after Tolkien, right? There's something enchanting about these worlds that we don't see around us necessarily, but there is an enchanting reality within the world, and it awakens and illuminates our imaginations in this special way that we can't even always fully explain in a sense. And that was really stood out for me. And one thing I describe myself as is, um, so like I always I've thought about this a lot, and sometimes I knew a lot of guys that were like into like army men growing up, right? Like they like were obsessed with like World War II and stuff like that. And there's like nothing wrong with that. I think that's great, and there's a lot of wonder to that as well. But I always describe myself as a kid who was more into like knights and swords than like army men and like rifles. I'm not going to say one is better than the other, but that was just like my draw. So I think something like Dark Souls was enchanting, but it was almost like enchanting in an adult way. Whereas when I was a kid, the world and lore and mythos of the Legends of Zelda was super enchanting to me as a kid. I still think it's interesting and enchanting as a 30-year old, by the way. So I'm not going to say it's childish. It's C.S. Lewis, right? It's like you love childish things, then you don't love childish things, and you grow up and you love childish things again, right? Like it's like that's like kind of like how I would think of like Legends of Zelda. But Dark Souls is not for kids. It is for adults, but it's enchanting in just a totally different way. And I mean, just want to talk about like how like I've never seen outside of like a fantasy book series or like some of the old Icelandic or Arthurian English tales. It's like outside of some of that, I've never really seen anything else with such a rich lore and just like story behind it. But the story's not on the nose, it's not explicit. Like you have to learn, you have to kill things and read artifacts and put the pieces together, and honestly, then watch hours and hours and hours of basically Dark Souls scholars on YouTube to really actually understand what's going on. And there's a lot of meaning there. Like long story short, like it's profound, right? And I think sometimes people can even play dark like in like the Dark Souls series just for the challenge, and that's great. And maybe they subconsciously reap some of the imaginative and philosophical aspects of that in a way. But I think like even just to play it for the challenge of supreme, uh, refined melee combat is still like missing out on all like the richness of meaning written into those games and designed into those games.
So you both talking about Dark Souls a good bit, which I've actually never played Dark Souls. I'm not super familiar other than just seeing, you know, glimpses here and there. So, I mean, it might provide a good case study here. Like, what in particular is so enchanting about it? And either of you can take that up.
So I haven't really gotten deep into the lore yet of Dark Souls. I'm still on my first playthrough of the original game. I've played a couple of other From Software, same developer titles. One being Elden Ring, which is their most recent release. Well, the most recent Souls-like release. Anyway, which came out in 2022. It has a similar sort of sheen where it's this dark fantasy setting. The world's kind of trapped in this cyclical cycle where no one really dies. Whereas like the Tarnished and Elden Ring, or the undead and um, in Dark Souls, were kind of you just kind of this cyclical cycle to life, which you're a little bit seeking to break. So there's, so that you could probably teach a whole course just on that concept, right? Whereas it's like you've basically created immortality, and you're realizing how awful it truly is. But even without having, it's like as we're having this conversation, I'm like, oh, that's right. I keep meaning to go on YouTube and, like Josh said, find the, watch a Vadi video or whoever else is doing the videos on all the Dark Souls lore deep dives. But one of the things that really stands out to me that is most enchanting in Dark Souls, you spend a good amount of time underground, or at least in very dark places, and there are moments where you see sunlight. Um, like there's a whole long section of the game where you're going through is essentially the sewers, and it's fairly early on, and then you finally end up in the boss room, and there's this big crack in the ceiling, essentially where sunlight's shining through, and it makes me think of the scene in the two towers in Aderos where they see it's described in the book as the single high window through sunlight shining through, and then that same theme comes back with the single star that Sam sees as he's on I think it's the plains of Gorgoroth, and it's just kind of this message like not all is dark, right? You've been going through this incredibly dark, depressing area, and even as you're about to take on this giant dragon-like boss, right? You still see this beam of light coming in that kind of tells you there is hope here. There is an end, right? You're about to take on a very difficult fight, but you have something to look towards. And that, you know, just I love being able to just kind of immerse myself in that world, and even not knowing that much yet, not having read every item description and ever looked up every enemy on the wiki, just seeing this and seeing what I think it's trying to tell me. Yeah, it's super, super cool.
Cool. Yeah. I definitely appreciate those themes, the immortality as well as the light. It definitely makes me think of Tolkien, a lot of the stuff that he deals with, which, I mean, naturally, anything fantasy, I'm going to read Tolkien into it.
Yep.
I mean,
Oh,
it kind of makes
absolutely.
sense. Not without merit on that.
Yep.
Okay, cool. So, yeah, my expansive fantasy I've lived in for years now regarding video games at least really goes to Elder Scrolls, which I know Sam, you just recently started Skyrim for the first time, right? Which I don't know how
I
you managed
did.
that.
I mean, I've heard of Skyrim. I think I heard about Skyrim the year it came out because that would have been right around when I started college. And thank goodness I didn't start playing it then because I don't think I would have graduated. And I've not I've barely dipped my toes in because I was staying up with our newborn, and I bought it recently when it was finally bought it when it was like $4 on Steam. Um, and I was like, okay, I hooked my laptop that I have for gaming on up to our TV. I'm sitting there with my sleeping newborn on her lap at 2 in the morning or whatever, and like, all right, let's start playing Skyrim. Um, and so, I mean, like I said, I've barely dipped my toes in. There's not even much I can formulate about, my thoughts about the world yet, unfortunately, because it's like, okay, I'm just starting to understand kind of the world building that's going on here. So I wish I could talk more about it, but unfortunately, just not much yet.
Fair enough. I had to ask. It's unusual you find somebody today who's playing Skyrim for the first time. Such a such a major title. Um, yeah, and I started with the Elder Scrolls all the way back with Morrowind, which was, I mean, a little bit advanced from you, when it first came out, given, my age at the time, but I had older brothers, and so I was always playing a little bit ahead of most people my age at the time. Um, but I mean, speaking of just vast and enchanting worlds, I mean, it still boggles my mind that, within each of these major Elder Scrolls titles, I mean, they have literally entire books, like libraries of books written within the games. And so the fact that, they are willing to, invest the time in writers to literally write books in the game, most of which are going to go unread by, those who are buying the titles. It just, I think, shows a level of detail, which, unfortunately, moving forward, I imagine all such things will just be AI generated. But at least once upon a time, they really took the time to, invest in such little storytelling details that, it's easy for me to look at a title like that, as well as whatever comparable fantasy series are out there, Dark Souls, whatever. And it's easy for me to look at that and recognize the potential for enchantment, the potential for expanding your engagement with with ideas, with philosophy, with kind of what could be. I do think that there's a lot of inherent value in that. Um, well, I guess, I mean, from here, I mean, it'd be interesting to hear about, some other titles that have sort of captured your imagination, that have captured your time, and just to dig into a little bit about what it is about these particular titles that stand out to you. So, I mean, Josh, what's something else that has been, near and dear to you?
Yeah, I'll run with this one first just because I mentioned it earlier. And I think it really is like the only, okay, that's a lie. I did play Elden Ring. I was going to say this is the only game I've played that's come out since 2020, but not Elden Ring, but Cyberpunk 2077. I wanted to talk about that. And um, I don't know if I would definitely wouldn't exactly use the word enchanting to describe it, but I also think that's kind of the point. And what I like about Cyberpunk 2077, I mean, first of all, like the writing is incredible, great character arcs, great dialogue back and forth between like your the protagonist in which you play and the various recurring like side quest characters that he encounters in Night City, in the outskirts of Night City, which is the setting of the game. Um, but I think what's really profound about that game is that it almost to me um it almost captures like a fairly realistic version of like what the future could be in a sense. Because I liked Star Trek growing up, and I guess like to some extent I still do like the Next Generation and even like Deep Space Nine to some extent. But one thing I kind of like abandoned when I got older is I found like Gene Roddenberry's kind of like conception of the future just super like utopian, and it's like everything's gonna be super diplomatic with all these aliens, and like everything looks crisp all the time, like their uniforms are always perfectly perfectly like steamed and pressed and all that, but the ship is beautiful, and there's nothing, it's a very like glorified depiction of like the progression of science beyond the time that we'll probably all, you know, beyond the time that we'll probably all live up to, right? Like hundreds of years in the future. Whereas with Cyberpunk, the future looks kind of gross, right? Like I don't know if either of you ever been to like Times Square in New York City, and I always heard about it and thought it would sounded cool as a kid. And I went for the first time a couple of years ago, and I thought it was kind of gross. It's like there's just a bunch of weird characters walking around in the middle of the day, and there's just big giant screens with not beautiful images on them in any sense. And that's kind of like what like the vibe of Cyberpunk 2077 is. And people are kind of gross in it in a sense too. But I think what it really captures more than anything is kind of like the ramifications of one, like taking like technology and science too far as humans, probably the over reliance on science and technology, and the way in which our kind of like just our human condition is kind of put on display even more so because of technology, and how the things that have always been there for all of human history, like since the fall especially, um, have been prevalent and real. But there's a way in which technology and the evolution of science and like the data network and the rapidness of communication puts that on like full display, and the way that that's even modified as people are basically, you know, at this point like half robot and like, you know, part human part robot, having implants and all these things, asking the questions, even like basically anthropological questions regarding like what actually is a human, and are you still human or fully human if you have these implants. It really deals with all of those things really wonderfully. And I'm trying to hit it all here, so I'm kind of ranting and speed talking through it a little bit just to hit the high points. But I can't recommend that game enough because it's not necessarily beautiful, but it's meaningful, and it really, I think, asks a lot of thought-provoking questions and explores them quite nicely.
Yeah, that one's been on my Steam wish list for sure. I'm like waiting for it to go on sale or something, just waiting to find the time. But yeah, whenever I see people or I see like ads or people YouTube videos, whatever, people with the I don't know, whatever Apple's headset, AR, VR headset that's like just wear this while you're cooking dinner and stuff or whatever, interact with your family with it. I was like, yeah, so I see Cyberpunk and I think of that and went, yeah, okay, that's definitely a future we feel like we're creeping closer towards.
Mhm. Also, if you have any like affinity for Keanu Reeves whatsoever, his likeness is like one of the main characters in the game, and he's a huge jerk, so it's really funny.
Yeah, I really appreciate what sci-fi can do in presenting just the warnings against, well, science, right? Progress, technology. I mean, I've always felt that anybody with any kind of sense of things recognizes where technology can go amiss. But I mean, after reading, Lewis's Ransom series, that really put me on. The scientists are the demon possessed villains behind closed doors here. uh, one of my favorite things about those books is the ending, especially the epilogues of like Out of the Silent Planet, for example, where at the end, Lewis basically comes out and says, "Oh, by the way, this stuff is real. Now go cast down the demonic scientist." And I saw that article coming out a few years ago about how Lord of the Rings is radicalizing, but nothing is as straightforward as Lewis's epilogues in those books against science. But yeah, I mean, my go-to dystopian look at the future is definitely Fallout. I know that's super mainstream, but I've been on board since Fallout 3, New Vegas especially. Played a lot of Fallout 4, although New Vegas is definitely the best game objectively. But and even the show, I think, was done really well in tune with the spirit of the games, where it is, we're obviously in this disaster scenario. Civilization's been destroyed. We're dealing with the remnants that are left, and everything is just gross and mean and dirty. But there's still these glimmers of goodness, glimmers of hope. This reminder that like life does go on, life can go on, even when everything externally is stripped away. And I actually think that as much as you can expect Amazon to do, I felt like they decently maintained this with the show in that, even like Lucy, the main character, part of her story is, she's like the bright character in the wasteland. She always has this positive attitude. She even, maintains fidelity to the golden rule. That's a kind of an ongoing theme here, even, to, well, people who aren't very nice to her. And so, again, is it like a Christian franchise? No, certainly not. However, I do think that there is just some of that resilience of life, resilience of goodness that can be found through, I mean, this, post-apocalyptic, retro future look at things. And so that's my go-to, dystopian franchise of choice. Um, Sam, tell us about. You can either comment on any of that or just go off on something else.
Remember, I need to both play Fallout. I have New Vegas in my library, but I need to, and then I actually want to watch the show, because I probably wanted to include it in a video that I'm going to make in the future. But so again, it's another series that I'd like to explore. And yeah, when you talk about, franchises, that most any franchise is not going to be a Christian franchise or a Christian story. Even Lord of the Rings is not. It is very much Christian, but it is not. It is not a sermon. It is not a homily, right? And I have said this many times. I will say it many more times. Christian movies generally suck because they don't care enough about the movie part, right? They're trying to communicate their message to a broader audience by making a movie. This is what Hollywood has been doing, just from the opposite end of the faith spectrum, where they don't really have much faith. They don't really have much morals for the most part. They just kind of have a vague sense. I mean, it's like Marxist morals, basically, where it's like, yeah, these people are oppressed. We need to make sure we support them until they become the oppressors. And it's cyclical. Anyhow, right, this is what Hollywood has done. They've forgotten a lot about, especially big mainstream Disney, forgotten about the movie part, the art, right? The telling a story in a way that no one else can, and they just want to tell people things, which doesn't work. Anyhow, that's my little soapbox. So when you talk about, movies, franchises, games, whatever, being Christian, most of them are not going to be. But Peter Crichton is in Philosophy of Tolkien, repeats this phrase from one of Tolkien's letters at least twice. I'm halfway through the book and he's repeated it at least twice, where Tolkien says, that, more important, or at least the objective of, something like Lord of the Rings is the elucidation of truths, right? The encouragement of good morals by showing them in these, real but fantastic ways, right, within these characters. So that's, whenever I'm approaching and analyzing some media, which is what I do on the channel, right? I analyze it from a Christian perspective, but from the lens of virtue and, growing in virtue, growing in love of others. Anyhow, so when talking about actual games that I actually care about, were you about to say something, Andrew?
Yeah, I was just going to say that. I mean, the Christian way of viewing anything is to find truth wherever it is and to recognize
Yep.
it as such.
Yep.
It goes all the way back to Justin Martyr, right? I mean, all truth is God's truth wherever it can be found. And so I definitely agree with you on that. I mean, the way that Tolkien goes about writing his story is he told the story he had to tell, then he looked back and said, "Oh, I wrote a Christian story."
Yep.
That's what he basically says in one of his letters.
Yep.
And so yeah, I'm just echoing what you said. You can continue.
So tying into that, it'd be the games that have two of the games that have captured my attention in the last few years are the God of War games. So specifically the more recent two. So one came out in 2018, which is just called God of War, even though it is really God of War 4, and then God of War Ragnarok, which came out 2022, I believe. So they're a continuation of the original God of War PlayStation games. One, two, and three, and a couple in between, which follow the tale, if you're not familiar, of Kratos, who is a made-up character. He's a son of Zeus, because who in Greek tales isn't a son of Zeus? Who basically whose wife who is tricked into killing his own wife and child in his battle lust by Ares. And in revenge, he ends up tearing down all of Olympus and throwing all of Greece into chaos. And then he attempts to what's the word that you have to use to be algorithmically correct? He attempts to unalive himself, and that's where God of War 3 ends. Follow up, you catch up with him a decade plus later in God of War 4, in the reboot, and he's now in Norse mythology. So he has found a new life. He is married, Um, a Nordic woman, a giant, as we find out, and had a son who's, I think, about 10, 11 years old in the first game. And the first game begins with his wife's funeral and him having to figure out how to raise this kid to be a father, to be a good father when he never really had that example. Um, and his struggles with his past, right? His struggle with forgiving himself, right? Finding, redemption just for himself, right? That is a huge, huge theme. Right? Obviously, someone who's done horrible, horrible deeds in the past, finding for self-forgiveness and redemption, that remains a theme throughout, both of the reboot games. And so those stories absolutely captured my attention because, especially as a father myself, even though my kids are a bit younger, just struggling with, whatever struggles I may have and how I really do not want to pass on my own faults and flaws to my kids. Um, seeing him, grow in humility, right? And meaning that in the very truest way where he learns to know himself and his place, right? But yeah, forgiveness and redemption, by far the largest themes in those stories. And that, again, it's a very Christian message, even if the developers are probably largely not Christian. Certainly, the studio as a whole is not explicitly Christian, but that's kind of Christianity's whole thing. So, but it is beautiful, and it's one of the wonderful things that even people who aren't Christian, they can realize that, right? Because I mean, it is just an obvious truth. If you just tell people that, yeah, you can't change what's done, right? You have to move on. Um, at the near the end of one of the last games, not to spoil it too much, but one of the characters says to Kratos, "Don't you know what I've done?" And Kratos responds, "Yes, but what will you do now?" And that plays over and over and over in my head because that's it, right? Because I certainly have the temptation to look back on what I've done, whether it was 5 minutes ago or a year ago, and go, "What was I thinking? What's wrong with me?" And the answer is, who cares? What are you going to do now? So that's definitely on the more story spectrum of the games that have really captured my attention. There's lots of others, many far less story driven, but for the sake of brevity, I'll cut it there for now.
Well, good. I mean, that, final thought that you left off with there, I mean, it reminds me of what you said at the beginning of the conversation regarding the, persistency of like Dark Souls, and that, it presents the scenario of, okay, you got to deal with what's in front of you and, figure it out essentially. In one of my philosophy classes, my students recently read Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, in which Frankl was a psychiatrist, Holocaust survivor, comes
Mm.
out writing the book on how he maintained a life of meaning even in the camps. And he makes the point that a lot of times we ask the question of like, what is the meaning of life? And I mean, I think that's a perfectly valid question. However, he reframes that and says what we also need to be asking ourselves is, what is life demanding of me? That's a different kind of question. A lot of times when we ask the question, what is the meaning of life? We Even though, again, as a Christian, like I have answers to that, but I feel like a lot of times when we ask that question, we make it so abstract as to hide from any responsibility that might come from the answer. Whereas if we ask the question, like, what do I actually need to do today? What are my responsibilities today? What do I do in light of the things that I've done yesterday? Like, given the facticity of what's before me, what do I do with that? And I think that is at least tangentially related to, some of what you brought up there. Um,
Absolutely.
Josh, do you have any experience with those games?
I do not. Those are games that when they first came out, I was a little bit younger and I wasn't allowed to play them. Again, probably a good decision by my parents at the time. That was like mid
Yeah.
2000s, I think. So, but I have been recommended those two most recent God of War games, not just by one friend, not just by two, but probably at least three or four friends now. So that's probably a sign that I do need to visit those next time I play a new game.
Sam, were you about to say something? I feel like I shifted.
No, no, it's the original God of War games, which I played when I was making my first video on Kratos. I played God of War 1 and 3, and they were very, very violent. And the latter games are too, honestly. So I mean, Kratos is it's very much fantasy violence. So the enemies are largely fantasy characters, fantasy monsters. So Draugr, right, undead, form, zombies basically, or werewolf like creatures or whatever. One of which Kratos is finishing move will grab the thing's jaw and rip it in half. Right, it's just there's a character who exclaims, "That'll haunt my dreams" when he does that, and it makes for some funny moments. But they're rather brutal, right? They're M-rated games, and they treat Kratos as the hulking Spartan, god there that he is. So yeah, not good game for kids. They get a little rough for sure. But yeah, I add me to the list of people who wholeheartedly recommends them. In terms of scope for a lot of modern games, they're not horribly long. The first one is maybe 20 hours. The second is I think I finished it in under 30. Especially because I didn't bother playing on a higher difficulty because I wanted to experience the story. Those are very, very good, very well done games. The writing is excellent.
Yeah, it's just now that you brought up violence, I should say that I don't know all of who's watching and listening to this, and so I don't well I endorsed Fallout a little bit ago. Speaking of violence, the show games grossly violent, like over the top campy level of violence, which doesn't really bother me because it's like so over the top. But that's definitely something you have to be okay with if you're going to engage at all with anything related to that franchise. Uh, Now, as far as okay, another game of choice that I can bring up here, you know, in addition to Elder Scrolls, Fallout, one that I find myself returning to on a fairly regular basis, even still, at least every couple of years or so, Knights of the Old Republic. Right, definitely top tier Star Wars games, top tier RPGs in general. I think that this is just an era of Star Wars history, lore that's so rich for storytelling. It's back when Star Wars maintained obvious differences between good and evil. The Jedi are good, the Sith are evil, and I think that that is just so much more compelling from a story level as well as accurate philosophically. And I, well, like most things, go back in history and there's a lot more to deal with, and well, the modern storytelling. I'll put it that way.
I'm really glad you mentioned this because there's like I don't know enough people who have played those games, and it bothers me sometimes. Nothing against people who haven't played them, but I want more people to play those games, especially people who are you know fans of Star Wars, people who are maybe controversial, but real fans of Star Wars. People who respect the original trilogy and hate the sequels and such things, right? Um, but that I always what I like wanted what I wanted when like they like announced the Force Awakens, right? Episode 7, Force Awakens, that's what it was called. Whenever it was like 11 years ago when they announced that, when they were like saying they were making a sequel trilogy to Star Wars, it's like going in the direction that like KOTOR was is like what I wanted them to do, right? Especially like the second game where it's like you really have like Krea's almost like this like Nietzschean, like Zarathustra like type of figure who's kind of like challenging you to it's almost like it can be like taken as like deconstructionist in some way of like the Jedi and the Sith, and I guess it kind of is in some ways, but in some ways she presents like this via media like really like gray path between the two. In some sense, she's like kind of just like hates the Force altogether and wants it to die, but all those are really interesting ideas to explore in Star Wars, right? And one of my I've been watching the Star Wars original trilogy since like before I can even remember, right? So I'm talking to somebody who has been a fan of those movies my entire life, and um, I think like the thing I noticed like when I grew older and got a little more mature with Star Wars is like I like the writing in the original trilogies, I like the stories, I like all the character arcs, and I more than like I love the world of Star Wars. Like the original Star Wars, it's just a really cool world. Like a lot of the design of the different characters, the different races, the different planets, like the scapes of like the cities and the deserts and the jungles, like all of that. Like it's a really cool world. The Jedi is a really cool idea. Basically these kind of like monastic knights with laser swords in a sense. Like that's a really cool idea, right? And it was in a sense like probably in some ways really original in its time. But the problem I've always seen with Star Wars until like besides like really with KOTOR is that they have a great foundation that they never really built off of. The original trilogy set up so much there that could be explored with literature, with philosophy, with a lot of interesting ideas and dynamics and character arcs. And then, I'm not going to really talk about the prequels because we could just talk about all the memes and the acting and the script and all of that. But with the sequels, I feel like there was a real opportunity there with honestly some quality actors, some big name Hollywood directors. Maybe J.J. Abrams could have done better. Maybe he couldn't. I don't know. But those ideas, like I wanted them to be explored so bad. In Episode 8, it really seemed like with the trailer and like the hype up to that, they could have explored some of these ideas from like KOTOR 1 or KOTOR 2 in it. And then it was just kind of a schlock fest, to be honest. I'm just gonna say it. Like it just was. And they didn't do any of that with like Luke. They didn't do any of that with Rey or Kylo Ren or any of these people. It was a huge disappointment. But well, all that to say that like KOTOR 1 and 2 are the Star Wars story that like I always dreamed of, but has never been told on a screen or even in a book necessarily. It's in these semi-obscure video games from the original Xbox, which a lot of people didn't even really play in the early mid 2000s, and they're just kind of, I'm afraid sometimes it's just gonna be like lost in history. And I'm like, this is the greatest Star Wars story ever told, and few and far between people have experienced this or even know that it exists. And like, there's my plug right there for you to play those games. It's like if you're looking for something rich in the Star Wars universe, it's like there's your story. Play the KOTOR games, especially KOTOR 2, especially.
Yeah, I definitely second that. I'm not going to go too deep in it because we'll be having some chats on it in a couple months. We'll be doing some patron chats on it. But you brought up how in the second one, Kreia like basically tries to deconstruct the Force, essentially deconstruct the lines between good and evil, the Jedi and the Sith. But what makes that different than what happens in the newer movies is that she's the obvious villain. Like she's doing something wrong, which just shows that the stark contrast in storytelling. Whereas in so much of, I mean, I know that it'd be easy to spend the rest of this conversation just hating on the new movies, but so much of those movies are just they're deconstructing in the wrong way, which is the spirit of the age, I suppose, where all the heroes get ripped apart. That Han Solo, obviously one of the coolest characters in the franchise, is now this like deadbeat divorcee, who's just like not really doing anything significant anymore. Luke, I mean, he's obviously a lesser form of what he really should have been by this point in his story. All the heroes are just getting torn down. The institution of the Jedi gets torn down as just this artifice of raw power. It's all about deconstruction, as if that's somehow spirit of nobility. I don't know. Um, but KOTOR is Star Wars as it should have been. Um, and honestly, I can't elevate it above the original trilogy simply because that's the original. But I think a case can be made that it is an even better story. But again, that's hard to say looking back. I don't know. Sam, do you have any experience with those games?
I've played the first one. I've yet to play the second one. I played the first one last year. For the first time, I set a deadline for myself. I said I'm going to play this game and I make a video about it by this deadline. And I kind of and then that was right before I was finishing another very long video. So I was a little bit rushed in that, and I didn't do as good of a job as I would have liked. And I admit I played the game under like a little bit of time crunch, so I probably didn't enjoy it as much as I would have liked. I also played it 20 years after it came out, and I would have enjoyed this a lot more 18 years ago if I had played it before I had the expectations of what modern RPGs look like, just in their combat, in their dialogue, not the quality of the dialogue, but just how it's visually portrayed, where all the dialogue in KOTOR is just a talking head, which is not as interesting as seeing an actual dynamic cutscene. Such as technology, that's how it goes. I found the philosophy of that game to be wonderful. Again, it is very much a story of redemption, assuming you make light side choices. Um, and I mean, but even at the end there, right? Like Revan offers redemption to Malik. It's Malik, right? That's his, yeah. Even saying that, like I found it, you can find it too, despite him, persisting in his errors till that end. And yeah, and you find that message. You look for that message. You find that message everywhere. What can we do? Move on. You move forward. You can't change what's done. You can only move on. That's a direct quote from Red Dead Redemption 2. So it's I find it fascinating and wonderful that that theme runs through so many incredible stories. And yeah, I absolutely the storytelling and just the character dynamics of KOTOR are something that don't really exist in Star Wars anymore. Absolutely. I will refrain from bashing the sequels any further. You guys have done a fantastic job. I'm not going to do that. It's not what we're talking about. I will say one thing. It's fine for us as human beings living on planet Earth to say laser swords because that is our conceptual knowledge of a lightsaber, right? It's a sword made out of a laser. Luke says laser sword in The Last Jedi, and that drives me nuts because it's a lightsaber. He knows it is a lightsaber. They don't know what swords are. All they know are lightsabers. I mean, I suppose there could be some sort of swords or whatever, but it's a lightsaber. He says it in this, again, it's deconstructing, right? Like he's tearing down the idea of a very lightsaber by calling it a derogatory name. It drives me insane. Anyhow, the other Star Wars game, what?
So this is one of those Ryan Johnsonisms that was thrown into that
Yeah,
movie.
absolutely. Um, the other Star Wars game that I love to death. It's a very simple game. It takes maybe 6 hours to play through. Is Star Wars Republic Commando. It's another original Xbox game. I think it came out around the same year as KOTOR, 2004, 2005. I think it was like KOTOR, Star Wars Battlefront, and Republic Commando all came out right around the same time. So what a year for Star Wars video games. And it is, if you haven't played it, which you probably haven't because it really got buried. It's a story about a commando squad, or clone commandos, during the initially like the Battle of Geonosis, and then a couple later missions, including Battle on Kashyyyk, which is seen in Episode 3 of the prequels. And basically, they're kind of behind enemy lines missions, and it is fantastic. It's a short first person shooter, where you're just going through, you're fighting droids and Geonosians and mercenaries hired by the separatists. But what forms the core of the game is the bond that these four clone commandos share. Right? They all have their individual distinct personalities because otherwise it would just be kind of weird if they were in fact just the same person, even though they are the same person. And they have this incredible bond of brotherhood. My favorite thing to ever appear on a screen is Band of Brothers, the story about the 101st Airborne, one of their companies, right, in the war in Europe in World War II, because it shows this just how war forges this bond of brotherhood and how like that can be found like nowhere else, right? War is a horrible, horrible, terrible thing, one of the worst blights on humanity, but it forges some of the most incredible love. And I think that you talk about like the beauty of God's creation, like God's ability to, reshape and to make all things new, right? In a sense, right? Where he takes this horrible thing and he creates something incredibly beautiful out of it. Even if like, on Earth, may last a short time because men get killed in war, but they found this love that they couldn't find anywhere else. And that you find that distinctly, in Republic Commando, right? Where these four clones, right? They consider each other brothers. They would happily and immediately die, rather than seeing one of their comrades fall. It's a phenomenally done story. It's something I made a video about like a long time ago, and like I need to revisit that and talk about that more in depth. It makes me think of like Halo Reach to some extent too, where it is kind of they're doomed in a sense. That it's not quite the same as Halo Reach, where they all are doomed. But you kind of know this can't really be a happy ending, but you're there for the bonds that are forged, and yeah, it's very very good. There's another one. Just if you could find it on Steam for cheap, which it always is, and yeah, definitely want to check out.
Yeah, I think that your description just shows how rich Star Wars is for good storytelling because, a lot of times it's categorized as sci-fi, but it's not, right? It's fantasy that happens to be in space.
Hmm.
It's not technologically driven. It is a fantasy story. I mean, the Jedi are essentially wizards with swords, to I guess use a derogatory term. But I mean, while we're on this theme, I mean, another title, I guess I'm going back to the Old Republic, but the MMO is actually really good. The Old Republic MMO, and I don't play a lot of MMOs. I played WoW for a while when it first came out. I went from the beta up through Burning Crusade, but the Old Republic MMO really takes that basic model. It's kind of a WoW skin, like I guess a lot of things are more or less. But each of the classes gets its own character story that's basically KOTOR length, at least nearly, which I hadn't really seen before. To have that much replay value, that much variability, that much storytelling built into this one game, and it's uh, yeah, and so that's just I don't know. I don't have a whole lot else to build on that because again, it's like eight different games essentially built into one as far as the storytelling goes. Um, Josh, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I definitely don't know about the Old Republic MMO because I've never played it, but I was just gonna I was gonna second his recommendation, everything he said about Republic Commando, and also offer, since like you said, we're on the topic. Um, now you're saying it. There was a lot of Star Wars gems and from like 2000 to 2005, and Jedi Outcast, and then Jedi Academy. I'm getting them in the right order, I think, but they were basically like the stories of Luke Skywalker after Return of the Jedi, and him like he's like the new like Jedi Master. He's like the Yoda now. He's not like super old or anything. He still kind of looks like Mark Hamill looked like in like the mid '80s, but
He's
he
not
starts the
he's not drinking blue milk on the island yet.
no, he's not drinking some like alien's udder or something like that by any means. No. This never happens in that story, I don't think, thankfully, because they didn't, bastardize his character in any way. But it's really Luke, like right after, it's like a little bit after Return of the Jedi, and he's rebuilding like the Jedi. He's building the Jedi Academy, as it is in the name of the game title, and like it's that story, and like your character is basically one of his like the apprentices and Padawans there, and he's got this Jedi Knight named Kyle Katarn, who's like one of the most underrated Star Wars characters of all time. He's almost like Han Solo if he became a Jedi. He's got like that like charismatic like rogue smuggler, sarcastic personality type, but he's great. Those games are awesome too. I couldn't recommend them enough as well.
There's something I was going to say, but it slipped my mind. But yeah, okay. Glad I found another Republic Commando fan. The game has captured my heart forever. My wife's too, but she doesn't play a whole lot of games. Lack of time, and just not her favorite way to relax. But she bought me off Etsy a couple different Christmases, like two of the helmets from the game. So I those are on like on my bookshelf that stands behind me when I film videos. Yeah, phenomenal story.
That's super awesome. I have a friend that like makes he like made like Mandalorian helmets for fun. He's made like a helmet from Fallout and stuff like that too. But yeah, super cool stuff. I love when people do that.
Cool. Um, Man, I feel like we could probably go around all night talking about just different games that
Oh
we've
yeah.
played. Um, But I mean, maybe I'll throw one more, at least from my side. And really, I mean, originally it's built off the same model of KOTOR, and that, of course, is Dragon Age, which I played a lot of. I mean, I played one and two, and sometimes three on a fairly regular rotation for a while. Just another rich fantasy series. because I was there in the beginning, the clunky elements of Dragon Age Origins, never really bothered me, just as with KOTOR. Because I definitely recognize, as Sam says, that getting into those games can be difficult jumping in now without having that, without being there 3,000 years ago, as Elrond would say. Um, that, well, though, by the way, there is supposedly a KOTOR remake in the works. There's been one off and on. They've had some
Uh,
studio problems, but
yeah.
for everything I can tell, it's still happening at some point. But yeah, but Dragon Age, of course, is another one of those franchises that has just tanked to postmodern ideology. Um, Everything that I've seen from the latest installation that's come out had just ruined it for me. It's so easy, I think, for creators, for studios to move away from how do I tell a story to how do I tell the story that people, not even just that they want to hear, how do I tell the story that people should hear? Right. And that's when you get into propaganda. That's as Sam was saying. It's the other side of the I'm going to tell a Christian story, but I'm going to tell some postmodern Marxist deconstructionist story. And so it's just kind of a shame where things go with that.
I remembered what I was about to say. I've never touched the Old Republic. I've not played a second of it, simply due to lack of time. And also, I've never played an MMO, so I just haven't really dipped my toes in. But the cinematic trailers for that game are incredible. I will go and rewatch them from time to time on YouTube. They are some of the best storytelling like in the Star Wars universe, and I'm not being hyperbolic.
Yes, yes. I mean, those games are incredible for storytelling, as far as the in-game as well as the cutscenes. I mean, as far it's I mean, I have not played many MMOs. Like I said, I've played WoW. I've played a good bit of the Old Republic. I dipped my toes a little bit in the Elder Scrolls Online, but that just didn't last more than a few hours before I just decided that wasn't for me. But Star Wars: The Old Republic it's a fantastic game, and even if you're not into the MMO elements of it, which I tended to just play by myself. I'm an independent gamer for the most part. Um, you can go through those, play them essentially like single player games with just very rich storytelling. Well, I mean, is there anything else? I mean, like I said, we could go on all night. We won't do that. um, is there anything else, Sam or Josh, that you wanted to bring up?
We've talked a lot about like kind of story-driven games. But I think one of the aspects that makes games so good is that you can tell your own story, right? Like just your progress through the game is itself often a story. So two of my favorite games, that are both of my, top 10 hours on Steam are the XCOM games, not the original ones from like the early 90s, but the reboot from 2012 and then the XCOM 2 from 2016. And so basically it's an alien invasion. XCOM is the, multinational agency that comes together and unlike all other multinational agencies ever created is actually effective. So you're fighting back against the aliens and progressing your technology tree, doing various research, building out your base, etc. All those good kind of RPG like elements, but you are controlling a kind of a top down, almost like a tabletop game, squad of soldiers that on take turns, moving around the maps, the tactical turn based game. You move around the map, you shoot the aliens, you throw the grenades, you win the mission. Um, and this game would not be half as good if it didn't let you name your characters, but it does. And so you can name them Eowyn, Aragorn, Eomer, and so forth. Or you can give them names from Star Wars, or pick your favorite fantasy, series, or name them after your friends and family, whatever. All right. But then because you have characters, right? Because you have people, this is now a story, right? These characters now have arcs almost, right? Where they get wounded. They're severely, wounded by a plasma bolt from an alien, but they come back and they rise, the top rank, they have the most kills of the whole mission, right? Or, someone who's your star throughout the whole mission, gets the floor blown out from under them and falls to their death, right? So it lets you kind of create this story in your mind as you go through these games. And it's got lots of other elements which you could get value of. Again, it's planning, thinking ahead, perseverance. Make the games more difficult. Actually tactical thinking, not just rushing through. But I love the element of being able to create your own story. And this is where games, RPGs and the like are, really shine is that, the choices you make matter. And I think that's one of the things that games do tell people best because they're interactive. It forces you to make choices, and those choices mattering is, something that is obviously applicable to our everyday life.
So you mentioned that's one of your, highest hour count on Steam. What do you think is your number one Steam game? Most
Oh, I
hours.
know. I looked this up recently, and I know it's more than double anything else. The game is called Rocket League, and this is again very opposite end of the spectrum of everything we've been talking about. Rocket League is soccer with rocket powered cars. It is exactly what it sounds like. I think it's something like 600 hours on Steam, and I know that that number is maybe a little more half than my actual total number of hours in the game. So I played on Xbox and I played on like Epic Games for a while for whatever reason. That's a game I got back into in like 2015 when it came out. I played it a lot. I played it a lot with my friends. And it was a game I got very good at, which again, it's the most sport-like video game that you could possibly ever make because it's most sport video games, Madden, NHL, whatever, are just like press a button to throw a pass, shoot the puck, shoot the ball, whatever. And like there's very little actual refined skill in it. Whereas Rocket League is you have minute control over your car and it's all physics based. So how you hit the ball at what point, at what angle, what speed matters in, where the ball actually goes. Right. So it's just entirely skilled. There's basically no luck whatsoever. And having played a lot of sports when I was younger, that kind of filled that need for a little bit, whereas like wasn't competing in sports anymore. So it gave me something to really practice and get good at. So yeah, very different from most of the stuff we've been talking about. And that's kind of what I love about video games is where it can, bring out good in you. It can teach you all sorts of things. It can, be of value, even if it's whether it's, practicing a very specific skill in Rocket League or exploring deep and philosophical themes in KOTOR.
Yeah, and that emphasis on skill, that's something that sometimes I hear Elon Musk talk about, which I mean, he's not my number one philosopher, but when he talks about how that kind of hyper focus can help you to, for one thing, kind of reset your mind and separating out other things in life, take that little bit of a break, but also it just it trains your mind to hyper focus, and that itself is a good exercise from time to time. Um, uh, Josh, tell us what's your most played game, you think?
Most played game of all time or on Steam?
Wherever you want to go with that. I don't know, all time.
All time, I don't know if I might spend too much time thinking about that, so I might just have
Okay,
to go with
Steam.
Steam for now, just because I haven't checked this. I haven't even been on Steam in a while, to be honest. But I know for sure it actually is like the first Dark Souls game because I think I've beaten it like 11 or 12 times. I used to like quasi speed run it, meaning like I could like beat it in like maybe like 2 or 3 hours. But that doesn't make me a speed runner because there's like guys that play that game like naked with like nothing but like a caveman club and like they like play it with like the Guitar Hero controller and still beat it in 20 minutes somehow. Like I'm not I wasn't never that ridiculous, but I think that is like my most played game. And honestly, like it really was. Yes, it was fun, but I wanted to like keep exploring that world. It's Dark Souls one. The world's called Lordran, and I wanted to keep exploring Lordran over and over and over and over and over again. And that's what kept drawing me back to play it. It was like a comfort food for a while. It was like whenever I was like needed to like I don't want to say relax too much because you can only relax so much playing Dark Souls. But there was like a level where I was like, there's something that just feels like it's like going home after like a difficult journey in a way to like only go home and go on a virtually difficult journey. But there was something really comforting about just exploring that world, even though the world is sometimes terrifying. The world is sometimes challenges you to wit's end in a way. But yeah, something about that game just always kept bringing me back to it. So that's I have like I think close to 100 hours on that on Steam, so quite a lot.
Yeah, I mean, as with Sam, despite most of our conversation, my number one game is not story driven. It's actually Crusader Kings 2 by a long run. Um, which and that game, if you haven't played it, has a kind of a steep learning curve, but once you get it down, it's I mean, it's infinite replay value. I'm not going to tell you how many hours I have on it. It's kind of an obscene number. And then after that, then we get to the story-driven games, and we go to Fallout, Skyrim, and whatnot. Although Civ 5 is up there as well.
Yep, Civ 5 is easily in my top 10. But again, there's a story within that game, right? Like my wife and I would both play Civ 5. We'd be playing, we were in college, but separate colleges. We'd play Civ 5, our individual games, and we'd get on Skype back when Skype still existed, a couple times a week, and we'd talk about our Civ games. We talk about the story, what wonders are you building? You go into war with anybody? Has anybody, been harassing you, right? Has England constantly been attempting to trade with you? And you have to tell us what the go, pound sand. Like, there's, I don't know. I love the ability to just tell a story with, the ability of games to tell stories, even when they're not telling a story.
Yeah, and that's part of the value of sub creation when they give you that room to tell your own story, to participate. That's why, Tolkien says that one benefit of literature over movies is that you have to visualize things in your own mind, and so to that extent, every reader has a somewhat of a different story based off what their experience, other things they've read, the various things that go into forming your mental images of what's playing out that you participate in the act of subcreation as a reader versus a movie where you're just watching something play out. I think a similar case could be made for video games, at least for a large number of video games, when you play a role in creating what the story is. I mean, yes, you're operating within certain parameters, but you are also operating in certain parameters when you read a book. You're dealing with the text that's given to you. And so I think that that case very easily could be made.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, really that applies less to story-driven games than it does to a lot of others. Because most of games, like the God of War games that I'm thinking of specifically, they are largely movies, right? Where there's a lot of gameplay, but then there's a cutscene, right? And there's kind of this long cutscene. Something like KOTOR which is still very story-driven, is less like that. There is much more sub-creation available to you than games which are like, okay, they're telling you this story and you're playing through it. So it kind of depends on the game. There's a lot of variation there. But yeah, I think absolutely. I assume that's from one of Tolkien's letters because most everything that Tolkien says that I haven't already read is from his letters, or I don't remember anyway. I've read some of them. Um, but yeah, I hadn't heard that before, so that's fascinating.
yeah, yeah, he really gets into that in his essay on fairy stories.
That's fairy stories. Okay.
Mhm.
Yeah. Something I've read parts of, but I don't think I've ever sat down and read the whole thing.
Yeah, it's definitely worthwhile. I mean, he has a lot of literary references that most people, myself included, like I don't follow all of his references that he makes, not yet. But as far as just the basic idea he's laying out there, it's really foundational to the way that I engage with stories in any format. So definitely would recommend that to anybody listening. Um, Right. Yeah, so I feel like we covered it's good ground the basics of what I wanted to discuss. I mean, is there anything that Josh or Sam you feel like should be brought into this that hasn't already? It's okay if not, but I don't want to cut off any thoughts.
I don't think so.
I was kind of curious, and maybe we've already touched on this enough, so let me know. But like the idea of like games that, and like I guess we did kind of talk about this with Dark Souls, but games that like don't have like an explicit like narrative, but almost like tells its meaning through like symbolism and aesthetics, if that makes sense. So I think like um something like Legends of Zelda might like fit into that category more, where I guess like there is like an explicit story, but sometimes there's more beyond the story, or sometimes it's just the story's really basic, but there's more within the world. And one game I wanted to bring up in that regard, in case anybody else has played, is I was curious if anybody had played Shadow of the Colossus, and if not, well, I'll like look that game up later first of all. But that's a game where there's this. It's kind of just simple. Like you're this boy, and you arrive at like this temple on a horse, and basically you have to beat these. I think it's like I don't even remember how many colossi there
I
are. I
think
think there's
there's
like
six. It's funny you mention it because I just picked that game. Like I've had it for forever, and I started playing it. I needed to like lie down on the couch because I'm dealing with like an injury. But I was lying on the couch. I was like, "Hey kids, like we're gonna just play this for a little bit. We don't do that very much." But I was like, so and they got all sorts of questions. So I literally just like beat like the first Colossus just the other day. But yeah, continue.
Oh no, for sure. That's super cool and coincidental to hear. But yeah, so there's like basically these 16 colossi, and it's like your character is like this. It's kind of like your typical 12-year-old boy with a sword in a fantasy setting, and he's got this horse which is sometimes incorporated into the combat, sometimes more, sometimes less. But like you're just dropped off on this huge plane, and you find the next colossus by he holds his sword up to like the sun, and it points a beam of light towards just the general direction you have to go, and that's it. Like that's the entire game, is just hunting down these six colossi. They all represent different like mythical beasts, and therefore you have different ways to um basically attack them. Like they're all like they're kind of like a giant humanoid boss puzzle in a sense. But it's just a really fascinating game, and it's so unbelievably unique. But that kind of like ties in with that concept I'm trying to get at here. It's like there's not like some explicitly deep story. It's not Fallout New Vegas where you can spend like dozens of hours just walking around, the desert of Las Vegas talking to different people, right? It's not, you don't really talk to anybody the entire game, but somehow there's a story being told there through like the substance of the world versus, the mouths of the characters in a sense. And I feel like there's like a category of gaming that is that too. That's sometimes not talked about, but it can be even overlooked because sometimes it can be seen as, oh, that game was dumb or something because it didn't have like a story. Like, what's the point? It's like, but there was something there, and I think sometimes people just it's over their head. They miss it.
Yeah, games have the advantage of that most like movies, TV shows will not of environmental storytelling, right? So developers, good ones anyway, will often, place objects in the world that tell a story that if you care enough, you will find and notice them. The example that comes to mind, the thing of when it comes to environmental storytelling is a game called Prey, Prey, that came out 2016, 2017, I think. And it very much has a story. It has a narrative. It's set in a space station, in the not too distant future that, it gets infected by an alien parasite essentially. Um, and but it has a lot of environmental storytelling, right? So whether it's notes that are left around or even just like I remember seeing this in a video, like someone's like baseball glove and pizza that are sitting out in kind of a like stowed away spot where you can learn about other characters who are mostly all dead anyway at this point, um, just by walking around and observing the world. And that's that you could apply the same sort of thing to Breath of the Wild, where you're going to learn about the history of the world just by observing, by walking around exploring, whether it's, just looking at every nook and cranny you can possibly find or talking to every NPC and exhausting every possible dialogue tree. And yeah, that is really cool where it's just the games really take in, and this applies to I think to games more than most media, but to all media because intentionality matters, like we said at the beginning. But you really do get in what you put out, or you really get out what you put in, and to an extreme extent, where yeah, you can blast through the main quest of Skyrim, which everyone told me not to do when I tweeted that it was my first time playing and I asking for advice, like don't play the main quest. I'm like, okay, got it. Yeah, so it's just explore, right? Experience. That's something that games can do that other media can't really.
Yeah, and that is for so long what has kept me with the Bethesda titles, with Elder Scrolls, with Fallout, that you it I mean it's kind of a running joke that the main storyline is the side story. Like
Yeah.
it's the last thing you want to do after you do everything else, because the purpose of the games is not really the story per se. I mean, I think that the stories have some value, especially when you go back to Morrowind and Oblivion. I mean, Skyrim's has a good central story too, but it's very simple. But the real purpose of the game, the value of the game, is in the exploration, the engagement, in the sub-creation of determining like what kind of role are you going to play in this world. And I think that's what gives something like Skyrim so much replay value. And that, yeah, even though you're doing the same stuff eventually if you've played it enough times, but you do it with your own sort of headcanon on who you are and what you're doing in this world, how you're engaging. Um, and Josh was talking about that like dynamic storytelling of just the nonverbal cues and whatnot, the symbolism, the aesthetics. And I feel like even in these Bethesda titles, like you get a lot of that when you're just wandering around and you discover like the way like you'll come across like a corpse that's in a certain way with other environmental cues as to what happened here. Fallout I think does this very well with the way that some of the settings laid out. And it's just it becomes this immersive, mysterious, enchanting aesthetic. Or I guess for Fallout, kind of disenchanting is more of the point. Yeah, and so I think it's a good point. Um, well, we've been running for like an hour and a half. We could, as I said, easily go all night just talking about different things. But I think we'll go ahead and wrap it there for now. I mean, maybe if we want to at some point in the future, we could hit up some more things. But I appreciate you, Sam and Josh, coming on, and I'm sure that we will talk again about something or another.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on, Andrew. We appreciate it. This is a great conversation. I enjoyed this.
All right, thank you for listening. And please, if you're not already, make sure that you are subscribed to this podcast. And if you're listening on the freebie feed, then make sure that you're also subscribed to the main Mythic Mind podcast, as well as Mythic Mind movies and shows, where we take a similar kind of approach, but with a focus on movies and shows. Right now, we're doing a Star Wars series. We just got to the prequels. And then over on the main Mythic Mind podcast, we're doing a few different things. Sometimes we have our book club on Augustine's Confessions. I'm also providing some material from my Fiction and Philosophy of C.S. Lewis course. Right now, we are coming up on the Screw Tape Letters. And so the next thing to come out from Mythic Mind will be over on the main Mythic Mind podcast. Not exactly sure what it's going to be. It might be Screwtape Letters, might be something else, but something will be coming out on Monday over on Mythic Mind. Now, if you would like to get access to all of our podcasts delivered into one feed, early and ad-free, then head over to patreon.com/mythicmind. Even $5 a month will provide you with full podcast access, early and ad-free, full Discord access, open invitation to these conversations that we have, and you'll also have some influence on where we go, right? You can join those conversations in our Discord server. And also, I've just recently announced a new course coming up, and so I'm going to go ahead and provide that course announcement right here, and that is how we will sign off. And so if you are on the freebie feed, then you will hear from me next time over on Mythic Mind on Monday. Till then, Godspeed. The Psychology of Soren Kierkegaard, a 10-week course led by Dr. Andrew Snyder, coming in the spring of 2026. What if anxiety is not just a dis-ease to be cured or to be wished away, but is actually a revelation of one of our most fundamental freedoms, a freedom that is awakened by possibility? And I don't just mean the possibility of doing one thing or another, not just the possibility of what might happen to you or around you in this world of changing fortunes, but rather the possibility that's presented by our own will, of our ability to determine what it is that we are and where we're going to base our identity. Who are we? What is our essence? Where will we seek for stability in this changing world? What even are we in a world that is constantly given over to change and to uncertainty? These are questions that we answer at every single moment, although we often fail to recognize that there's even a choice to be made, let alone that we are the ones who are doing the choosing. Most people today answer these questions by claiming that we are whatever we want to be. There's no one to tell us no or where to go. Truth, goodness, and beauty, and even what it means to be human, is entirely up for grabs. Because, as the secular existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre says, existence precedes essence, which means that we are thrown into this world without purpose or design. We have no boundaries, and we are all just making it up as we go along. Popular academia and even well-meaning theological critics often trace this thought back to Søren Kierkegaard, the 19th century Danish philosopher and so-called father of existentialism. However, as I argued in my doctoral dissertation, an honest reading of Kierkegaard will actually lead to very different conclusions. In this 10-week study, we will discuss 3 of Kierkegaard's critical and often very difficult psychological texts that formed the foundation for my dissertation: the concept of anxiety, the sickness unto death, and fear and trembling. The concept of anxiety provides a penetrating investigation into the experience and consequences of anxiety as the gateway to losing or finding oneself. The sickness unto death surveys the various forms that the loss of oneself can take, such as reality-denying hyper-imaginations, which run in the mainstream of today's thought, an inability to consider the possibility of change, or identification with transient things, and several other forms of despair, many of which often go undetected, at least for a time. Now, for a more positive outcome, Fear and Trembling focuses on Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac to demonstrate the leap of faith that results in one's true self. As Kierkegaard writes in one of his journals, "With God's help, I shall become myself." Whether you are interested in the history of ideas and you want to better understand Kierkegaard's role as a Christian who became dubbed as the father of existentialism, or you have more existential concerns, such as finding a better way to understand your anxiety as a potential pathway to living out your human purpose, or you want to root out underlying despair that seems to ruminate on the surface even in the good times when you stop to pay attention, or you want to discover what it means to live as a knight of faith, then join me in studying the psychology of Søren Kierkegaard. You can enroll in the individual course from the shop at patreon.com/mythicmind, or become a Tier 3 annual patron and get access to all courses that begin within that yearly term. A definitive date will be provided as the course gets closer, but you can look forward to this study in the spring of 2026. To get the best value, be sure to head over to patreon.com/mythicmind right now and become a Tier 3 annual patron. I hope to see you there.